Hi everyone, welcome again to the novice finals of Asian Schools Debating Championship 2022. I'm Jamie, I'm chairing the round, and with me I have an amazing panel who just introduced themselves as well. Just a couple of quick decorums again. At this sort of speeches, you may disclose your preferred gender pronoun and your preferred method of taking POIs if you wish to. Secondly, I'll give time stamps in the text chat, but you can always time yourselves. And thirdly, just maintain your general bid. All right, with all that being said, I think we can just get started. So the premise, you have the floor, you can start whenever you're ready. Best of luck to both the teams for the round.
All right, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are loud and clear.
All right, just for formalities, I prefer POI through voice. Please unmute yourselves. I'll tell you and I'll take you. Hopefully before 6 or in between points, just unmute yourselves. Preferred pronoun, she or they. Just give me a moment to set up my timer. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Comedy is powerful. It influences and affects us on what we actually see as something that is funny and see as something as something that is valid. Because there will always be an influence and there will always be some sort of reflection in society in each joke. I'm going to be giving 2 pieces of argumentation today. Firstly, how we actually empower people and minorities on the individual level. And secondly, how we allow better reclamation on the societal level, especially for these minorities. Okay, but before that, a couple of pieces of our model. Firstly, what are these comedians? They're seen by the public and oftentimes dominate online conflict. We can see Netflix stand-ups on these platforms. We see YouTubes who have entire sketches. We see TikToks where it's prevalent of different kinds of different skits, different kinds of TikTok content. They also have a high influence in what comedy becomes prevalent. Comedy spreads quickly and what is seen as funny is often discussed. Like when a viral stand-up video often is posted, it's talked about everywhere in your own circles as well as every institution possible because you see it as entertaining. You discuss what it's actually talking about. Second, I think slurs and stereotypes are quite self-explanatory. These are things that were previously used to hold back minorities or hold back people who are marginalized and make them feel like they were nothing but above these things and defined by these slurs and stereotypes. Third, thing to clarify is this isn't just a small impact debate about what is talked about in private comedy rooms and stays in these private comedy rooms. This debate is about how these comedians impact their individuals within minorities and what should or should not be used as comedy and how it will affect individual and societal level. First argument then, how we actually empower people and minorities on the individual level. One key piece of framing, this argument exists independent on the societal change because it means we help at least every individual gain some amount of solace regardless of what happens exterior, what happens to society and how they treat them. They're still going to gain this amount of solace. A couple of reasons why. First reason, on the principle level, we think that on opposition, they're going to deprive people against their personal agency and ability to define who they are if they continue to believe that comedians should be entitled to or allowed to be using these slurs and stereotypes within their comedy. This is independent of the pragmatic benefit and who is affected because we need to be consistent and be able to provide these for the individuals. They shouldn't forward these slurs and stereotypes because they contribute to these stereotypes that people who have fought so hard to fight against. You bring back these things back by making it the core of comedy, which oftentimes makes it the focus. Like several stand-up comedians make several skits just based on their race, based on their experience, and based specifically on how these slurs and stereotypes are going to be used. This is bad because it's a prerequisite for allowing further discrimination and allowing the stereotype to actually proliferate. People feel a lot more trapped under these stereotypes they fought so hard to fight against because it's seen as something that's going to be treated lightly, seen as something for a light and funny haha. People's efforts to fight against these struggles for them were their life. And for them, it was either going that or they're going to face some sort of death because of discrimination or kept against these opportunities for upliftment, which is something we ought to respect and allow them that level of security, validity, and give these people the most vulnerable reparations and validation. Okay, comparatively, what happens on our side? mainly two things. First, respect this principle and validate these individuals rather than making them feel like they're trapped under these own stereotypes with people under their own minority continuing to validate. We uphold these reparations for these individuals and allow them to feel protected, which is something that they never got to feel before. Second, we allow people to feel that they're not just butts of jokes, but brought on by stage comedians, and that these issues and experiences are something, although not the same as the ones talked about by the individual comedian on the stage, something that they can keep to themselves and feel like they were able to accomplish, not for just the butt of the joke. Second level then, on the pragmatic level and how we uplift individuals, we think that more people feel that stereotype is further enforced and pushed onto them by the people around them who see this content. We think that people in minorities or people in certain groups aren't going to be the only ones who are going to see this kind of content. Just because an Asian comedian posts and shows about the show, it doesn't mean it's only going to be seen by an Asian audience. Rather, it's going to be seen by individuals who actually attend the show themselves or individuals who see the YouTube content when it goes viral. So that means there's other individuals who are likely going to feel like it's going to be easy or available to use these stereotypes or content. People that means it's easy to justify or sweep aside issues that are deemed urgent. It looks like people literally thought the entire Asian minorities are the same, whether you're from China, Korea, Japan, or any part of Asia, we're the same because they have the small eyes, and blame them for COVID-19. People get hurt because they felt like that rhetoric was funny, calling it the Chinese virus, or this rhetoric was something not serious. But this is the one that contributed to a lot more hate crime and a lot more violence in status quo. People don't see these kinds of lives as important as any minority group because they are seen as a literal butt of every joke, and they'll turn out for marches and protests, especially when it comes to the individual. So there's minimal solidarity that can be seen because it's not an issue that is seen as something that is serious, seen as something you're worthy of turning out, and seen as something that actually gives an impact to society. I'll take you to Aina.
Do you not believe that these comedians have an inherent incentive to not be racist towards their own race?
I told you, it doesn't matter. Once you say a joke, you open it up to misinterpretation. Once you say a joke, you open up to audiences regardless of what your intentions are. Regardless of what your intentions are as a comedian, the way it affects other individuals, the way society continues to perceive it is harmful for the group you even tried to protect. And that's why we shouldn't make it the center of comedy. We shouldn't make it to be the most valuable thing. Second argument then, how we allow better reclamation on the societal level. One key piece of framing. We say reclamation is breaking down the perception or accepting the stereotype or slur in a healthy manner which can empower you as an individual or society. We tell you're not likely to get this on opposition side when you can keep letting comedians use this joke. First reason, we think the movement does not want to reclaim these stereotypes or slurs or make it even more difficult for the movement because they're seen as something that's treated lightly, treated as a joke. You're less likely as an individual or as a movement want to feel empowered by things comedians to say, haha, all Filipinos are nurses, or haha, all of these people are just bad drivers. When your features are seen as something that's laughed on by dozens and hundreds and millions of people, there's little to no incentive to want to make it reclaimed or want to make it feel empowering. Second, a lot of people are going to further push this thing and make it even more difficult for you to reclaim for yourselves. Because now it doesn't, even if you identify as this term or try to reclaim it like the word queer was, it's going to be difficult to reclaim it on the same level of other individuals or other people in society don't feel it's as serious or don't feel it's good. So if you want comedy to be a lot more better influential and protect a lot more people, you have to side with the proposition. Thank you.
Thanks to the Prime Minister for the fine speech. Can we please have Leader of Opposition whenever they're ready?
Can I confirm that I'm both audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
I will begin in 3, 2, 1. So I think it's extremely funny how government comes up to us and tells us and tries to express like, oh, we think these stereotypes are so bad and that these comedians will simply be expressing these stereotypes and slurs in simply like just a funny way and not have any deeper meaning throughout that. And I think that is where their biggest flaw in their case lies so far. So I would like to first start off with a bit of like explanation of what the status quo looks like. So firstly, minority comedians inherently have a small fan base because maybe subconscious bias still exists, as my second speaker will talk about. For example, like Jimmy Fallon, David Letterman are all way more talked about than like Lily Singh or Cheryl Underwood, aka comedy talk shows are an incredibly white dominated industry. And now comedians currently do occasionally base some comedy on stereotypes and slurs. For example, when Hassan Minhaj talked about Trump and his campaign in India, talking about how Trump was acting like we love the Hindus or whatever. And he used this as a way to express outrage towards how Trump treated the Indians. The comedians use this to spread culture with their audience or talk about their own experience and point out societal issues, as I'll explain later. And finally, people connect with comedy and the media a lot in general, and it's a very prominent platform for any type of discussion around stereotypes to exist. And now, secondly, a bit of characterization. These comedians have grown up around these types of stereotypes or experienced it and are the victims of stereotypes and slurs because as members of the minority communities and having grown up in a place that makes it able for them to, reach a point where they become a comedian, obviously they've been under the spotlight and they're famous, they will have had these certain stereotypes influence them. And also these personal experiences and the identities of these comedians is what makes them unique. It's what makes their comedy personal or intriguing. So like they have something to say or comment about and express towards their fan base. So now moving on to our arguments. Number one, by having these comedians talk about these slurs or stereotypes, it gives them more control over the narrative. So something that government side has completely neglected is like, how will they be able to control the narrative when they're making it funny? What might the comedy look like? So the comedy will actually look like things such as sarcasm, comedic satire, talking about their own experiences and criticizing these stereotypes, like criticism of these existing stereotypes, talking and pointing out these stereotypes as so ridiculous that they're therefore worthy of like being laughed at because of the fact that they are so outrageous, right? Now, why did they have the incentive to not have internalized racism or like be racist to themselves, right? Like I POI'd the first speaker, but she clearly did not really like understand it or did not really get the whole meaning of what I was saying. But because these people are literally from the minority group, like there would be backlash from their own community or other communities. The media can point out that they're being racist. They could get canceled, right? Because the media is so sensitive nowadays, the comedians would have to frame their comedy in a stance that isn't offensive, but still informs viewers about the stereotypes and slurs. And obviously, if a comedian paints one's own community as something worth ridiculing, they will face prejudice and face the repercussions as well. So obviously that's not what they want. They still want their minority group to be better represented in the media, and that's what they will try to do, right? They think that the comedians will laugh and say like, haha, yeah, all Asians are the same. However, what it would actually look like, of course, an Asian wouldn't want like a Japanese person wouldn't want like them to simply be characterized as like an Asian, right? Because these stereotypes are obviously harmful. So whereas it would be like, someone thought I was a Chinese whereas I'm actually Japanese, and base their comedy off of that and say and express how ridiculous, I'll take it later, how ridiculous this stereotype is for existing, right? And another thing to note is that the narrative still exists on government side, and without these comedians guiding the narrative, it's more likely for stereotypes and prejudice to go the wrong way. For example, like a white director directing a show about Indians without proper like representation of the control over the narrative. And if comedians that are representing these communities aren't talking about these things, then these messages will be controlled by some other methods, and that's where the general public will see it. And that's still like not very that's not the most effective way of like creating more change or a more accurate representation. And the impacts of what I've said about the comedians being able to say these things is that it creates a better image for the minority groups, right? Like it's a way of expressing to the world through comedy the struggles that they or others face because of stereotypes, like the raw and realistic things that they themselves, not maybe like someone like white observing what an Indian has gone through or whatever. Like it's made personal, and it's made like credible due to the fact that they're part of the community. And why this has to be done through comedy and not other forms of expression is because comedy is shared with the general public, right? People of a wide range of backgrounds see it. So like these comedians are able to represent their community and at the same time attack these harmful stereotypes. And okay, I'll take a POI real quick.
A comedian cannot control how people perceive their jokes or misunderstand when they misunderstand the meaning. Why is it going to happen for good on your side?
A comedian can still express a joke in a way that is obvious enough for the audience to understand. And I'm pretty sure people who watch like comedy talk shows aren't like idiots, because in comedy talk shows, people still talk about real life things like political issues and such. So this is something that my second speaker actually has as an argument or as an extension. So I will not talk further about that. And number two, I would like to talk about how it creates more accurate representation of the minority groups. Because like, as I've said, shows and other things are like, a lot of them are controlled by people not of like the minority group that are being represented in the show or whatever. And so therefore these minority groups lack the representation throughout the media. Their voices are not being heard, right? So otherwise, like without this, there will be little to no representation of these communities and lack of control over the narrative, which is obviously worse. Because as their role as someone famous is to represent their community by commenting the things, by pointing out the injustices that exist within their power, right? Like they can't simply go on ignoring them, because this is part of the principle of like being someone who is famous and has the ability to make some change. I'm very proud to oppose, sorry. Thank you.
Thanks to Leader of Opposition for the fine speech. Can we please have Deputy Prime Minister whenever they are ready?
Hi, I'll just set up my stopwatch. I prefer POIs verbally. I will take you. I'll just gather my thoughts and then start in a bit. All right. Before I start, I just want to thank everyone observing. Thank you for supporting us. I'll name you another time because, yeah, pressure. Anyway, starting my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 2 strategic observations about the LO case, and then I'll move on to the rest of my argumentation. Firstly, notice how their biggest benefit talks about taking control over the narratives around these stereotypes, but they fail to prove a few things. Firstly, they assume that the people in the audiences of these comedians simply won't go out and use these stereotypes and justify them using these slurs and whatnot. I don't think that's true, because all they really tell you is people aren't stupid, people aren't racist. You have to realize the audiences of these individuals aren't limited to people from the same community. You likely still have other people who don't have the same experiences, who don't have the same capacity to empathize with these stereotypes, to understand that these things are bad, to understand that these are things that you shouldn't be using. That means then I'm still not inclined to believe the entirety of Opcase when they tell you that they're going to bring light to issues and whatnot. But secondly, even if you don't buy that, I'm not too sure about 2 things. Firstly, I'm not too sure why comedy has to be the main way we bring attention to these issues. I would think there are alternatives. You look at the minority communities we're talking about this debate, you note that there are already other existing movements and other institutions that actively set out to talk about these struggles we've been talking about in this debate, that actively set out to correct and break down these stereotypes being pushed onto these people. I'm not too sure why it has to solely be comedians. But even then, you have to realize that in the instances where these comedians make these experiences out to be jokes, it ultimately makes it harder for these institutions to do the same reclamation we've been talking about. Secondly, note how, from an argumentation standpoint, they never engage with the 2 principles that comes from Kristen's case. Because independent of the outcomes in this round, we talked about, firstly, how it is wrong to continue to forward stereotypes in any way. And secondly, how it is wrong for you to use these stereotypes to directly harm people. Before I move on, sure, I'll take a POI.
POI?
Yeah.
How exactly are you going to be limiting the influence that white men who use these slurs or stereotypes are going to, like the influence that they have?
I feel like that's out of the debate. because you have to realize that these are larger social problems. It's difficult for you to correct it even at your best. But fine then, let's engage and say that's an issue. I'll talk about that at the end of my speech when I talk about how we reclaim these slurs and stereotypes in individual circumstances. Firstly, let's talk about the urgency really quickly in this debate, because I would think it's not just simply saying that we're talking about small comedians with barely any attention. Most minority comedians in status quo already have a wide reach, i.e., you look at Jokoy, you look at other minority comedians, you see these individuals on large shows, they're sponsored by streaming platforms, you see them being clipped on YouTube, Twitch, and TikTok. All of that is to say that they oftentimes have a lot of influence. That means then, at the point where opposition ultimately fails to engage with the argumentation from Kristen, they firstly fail to prove why they're able to sidestep a lot of the harms we push onto them. But crucially, they also fail to prove why things get any better on their side. Moving on then, let's talk about the first principle on why it's wrong to forward these stereotypes because they ultimately cause harm. Note that using these slurs in comedy oftentimes manifests in using them as the crux of your joke, i.e., you as an Asian joke about being a bad driver, you as a woman joke about only being a housewife. At the point where oftentimes you forward these slurs or you forward these stereotypes, you remind most of the individuals in your audience that these are things that exist. Inherently, that's bad for two reasons. Firstly, on the pragmatic, you reinforce these stereotypes that we've been talking about in this round. You push more people to believe that it's okay to use them, even if it's in a comedic context. You push people to think that, it's okay for me to use these slurs. It's okay for me to joke about these circumstances. I think that's ultimately bad because that means you push these stereotypes further on the individuals most harmed by them. But secondly, principally, it's bad because these slurs literally strip people of their agency. They limit you to a single role in society. You are forced to be trapped under the idea that all you can do is be a basketball player. All you can do is be a mathematician. All you can do is be a housewife. At the point where you push people into the same role in society, I think that's absolutely abhorrent. These are individuals that are deserving to be able to break free from these stereotypes. That only happens if you prevent people from ultimately justifying using them in the future. Secondly, on the second principle on how you directly harm people, I think it's clear already how terrible these slurs oftentimes are. But I think at the point where you as a comedian continue to use them in your comedy, you literally engage in the same harm we are talking about. Because oftentimes in status quo, the way these slurs are used is they are used in jokes. They're treated as comedic things. They are treated as comedic things and they're part of comedic situations. All of this literally contradicts and goes against with the way how people literally spend years of their lives trying to take back these stereotypes, trying to break them down, trying to break free and ultimately prove people wrong. Because at the point where you treat these things as jokes, you literally invalidate the experiences of most people down on the ground. At the point where you tell Asian individuals that all they really are is people that are good at math, I think that's absolutely abhorrent because you further reinforce and help them internalize that yes, that is all they're really capable of doing. That's all they're destined to do with their lives, and I think that's bad. But lastly, you have to note, even in their best case, where these individuals don't lead to racist outcomes, for example, I think it's absolutely terrible because that means you still do push. Because I think what's likely to happen is that oftentimes they create their own stereotypes as well about these comedians, i.e., you push people to believe that your comedy and identity only revolve around these stereotypes pushed onto you. You push people to believe that you as a minority individual are only defined by these slurs that exist around you. I think that's bad on two levels. Firstly, in terms of other members of the community you're part of, it literally further internalizes these slurs they've been dealing with all this time. But secondly, in terms of other audiences, once again, you push them into believing that it's okay to joke about these stereotypes. It's okay to use them in comedic situations because again, it's just a joke, and I think that's abhorrent. We tell you then it's better and ultimately it's easier for people to help reclaim these slurs on our side for two reasons. One, we literally don't push people into the role and further internalize the notion that they're only destined for one thing in life, that they're only defined by these slurs pushed onto them. We don't joke about their experiences and invalidate them. But two, when we make it harder for people to justify using these stereotypes because it's just a joke, it also means that it's harder for them to simply be invalidated in the process of them trying to break the glass ceilings pushed onto them, in the process of trying to prove that they're more than these slurs pushed onto them. I think that's important because that means independent of all all the argumentation we've talked about so far, we're the only team that's already proven why we're likely to help the minority individuals in this debate. We win this round for a few reasons. Firstly, we debunk the weak characterization that comes from opposition. We tell you how their model just does not fly. But crucially, we push onto you both principle and pragmatic arguments that ultimately stand. Thanks.
Thanks to Deputy Prime Minister for the fine speech. Can we please now have Deputy Leader of Opposition whenever they're ready?
Hi, can I confirm that I am audible and visible?
Yes, you are, loud and clear.
I'm going to be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. After 14 minutes from side proposition under substantive, we still haven't heard anything about how they're going to be able to benefit them, because their entire case is about how if you don't engage with any of these and ignore with these slurs and stereotypes, and if you ignore them, it's going to somehow be better. In my speech today, I'm going to be rebutting the proposition's entire case, and then moving on to 2 extensives. First, a principle about how these comedians should be allowed to talk about what you want, and you ruin the point of comedy. And thirdly, secondly, on how you allow people to connect with comedians on a deeper level in our side of the world. So first, some rebuttals. Their main point is that you empower minorities on an individual level. They tell us that you think that they're allowed to use these comedies and that you contribute in their comedy. This argument really hinges on the ideas that these comedies are going to include in an incredibly positive way. My first speaker has given you mech for why this isn't true, but then they rebut us by telling us that you cannot control the way it is. The way that the people are going to react to it, and it's going to end up becoming normalized. If the way that it is presented in the form of the comedy is like ridiculous, people are not going to look at it and see it as something normalized, just like people don't listen to rap songs and think like it's okay to use the N-words. Plus, if there are people who still use these slurs afterwards, this is not because like they saw an Asian guy using these slurs. It's ridiculous. The proposition tries to pin this on minority comedians. We think it's a form of victim blaming. White dudes aren't going to start using the N-word because they saw a black person do it. They're doing it because they're racist. And on proposition by saying that it's because of some minority comedian is like not blaming the actual reason for it. However, as my first speaker has said, you limiting what a minority comedian can say doesn't fix the problem at all, because this narrative exists on your side too. They attack us by saying that we can't control the reaction to these jokes or like the way it's taken, but you cannot control it either. Restricting minority comedians from making these jokes doesn't restrict the influence these slurs and stereotypes have. You just put more influence into the white dudes who are saying it. You just make it seem like it's more okay that white people can actually say it. Proposition thinks that like empowerment happens when you completely ignore and refuse to engage with these slurs and stereotypes. They literally say in their second speech that when you remind your audience that these stereotypes exist, this is negative in some way. They try and frame this as a principle when they don't have any mechanization for this, how this works. If you never engage with these stereotypes, they are just glossed over by the people who can actually frame it in a positive way, who can actually have a chance of controlling it. These are the minority comedians. Note that just because a minority comedian no longer talks about the stereotype doesn't mean that these minorities who are supposedly being empowered aren't going to have to encounter or hear about the stereotype at all on your side of the house. It just means that they have to hear about the stereotype, about these slurs and these jokes coming from a white person who doesn't represent them at all, who they cannot connect to, who actually has more damage and who has the chance to create more damage on your side of the house. You just give these men more platform, more advocacy for these who cannot claim these stereotypes, who cannot frame any way that is ridiculous, when they only paint these stereotypes as something that is acceptable, and on your side of the world, that is when these stereotypes are then normalized. Yes, I'll take your POI.
Isn't it more painful for you as a minority to hear someone who supposedly understands your context to simply joke about your experiences and invalidate them?
No, because they're not going to be like joking about your experience and invalidating, because as my first speaker has, there's so many reasons about like the way in which these jokes are, these slurs and stereotypes are actually going to be like presented. They don't have an incentive at all to be like actually joking about this, because first, backlash exists, and even if these minorities do have an incentive to actually push for more negative attention towards their minority group, they're also going to be negatively impacted. Therefore, we don't think in any way that they're actually going to be joking about it, saying, haha, I am just a housewife. For example, that's not their way they're going to say it. It's going to be done in a sarcastic and mocking way. And I think we all know that comedy is a lot about mockery and sarcastic. So nobody's going to look at a comedy and like see it as like a role model for what you do in real life. They also tell us that you are pushing people into thinking that minorities are only defined by stereotypes. This is such a great stretch that isn't backed by enough mechanism. If we go by then for proposition characterization, that comedy is so influential that there are all these shows that you see on Netflix, then nobody is going to look at a famous minority comedian and say, you're just stereotypes. Just like nobody looks at like, say, Michael Jordan and looks at them and thinks of stereotypes, because if they then, they'd have enough influence, so they directly contradict themselves on this point. Now on to two extensions. First, on principle, about how these comedians should be allowed to talk about what they want when it's their own minority group. It's inherently wrong to limit the ways in which people in minority groups are allowed to talk about themselves or try and present themselves to the world. A lot of comedian talk shows are often about like something funny, it's about like their own real life experience that is weaved into something funny. For example, Zero Showtime, which always talks about their real life experience. We've characterized at the beginning why it's possible that these comedians have faced racial discrimination. Panel, it's ridiculous that the voices of minority comedians are being limited inside Proposition's world, that they're not going to be allowed to talk about their own culture, their own experiences, the struggles that they have faced in their own life. Even if you don't buy this mechanism, there's no guarantee that even in Prop's best case scenario, 100% of all these comedians are inherently quite racist, that they're going to be talking about it in a joking way. So even if you ignore this, ignoring the way in which these jokes are being presented is still principally wrong, that you are limiting the voices of these minorities. Prop can't accuse us of saying that we're talking about minority, because irregardless of what circumstances, these stereotypes, you're putting a cap on the platform they can have on what they can talk about on their own show. Therefore, they completely contradict their own goal of protecting minorities. The whole point of comedy is that it's something you create. It's their own form of art. And we don't see why it should be principally correct for Prop to say that there's something you can't include in what you make, because there's this freedom to create when they are comedies. They're the ones making this show. They should talk about it. You ruin the whole point of what makes comedy comedy when you start policing what these comedians can or cannot say about their own minority group nonetheless. Now, onto my final point about how you allow people to connect with comedians on a deeper level. They tell us that like people are going to be so scandalized by it, but we'd rather think that when you claim something to be your own, there's this idea of like an inside joke within a group of friends. For example, the feminist movement claiming the word slut and saying that like, oh, I'm a slut, for example, in Sabrina Carpenter's new song. This doesn't mean that you're actually degrading themselves. They're claiming it. They're showing how ridiculous it is that just because they like, I don't know, sleep with a man, they're labeled as a slut or like a for example, they're showing how ridiculous these things are. This is what actually discourages people from saying these words, because they know that if they do actually now call like a woman slut, etc., they're going to be ridiculed for it, because these comedians and these social moves are able to show how ridiculous this is. Now, why is this something you only get from comedy? Because they tell us that there are social movements that exist. Comedy is all about making fun or like mockery and ridicule. Therefore, it's understandable that if you want to ridicule a stereotype or a slur, you do it through comedy, where it is more common, where people are going to see it and see it as ridiculous, because that is what comedy is all about in their mind. Therefore, I think it's very clear that opposition takes this debate. Thank you.
Thanks to the Leader of Opposition for that fine speech. Can we please have Go Whip whenever they're ready?
Okay, hello. I'm just setting up my timer and everything. Okay. All right. Am I both visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you. So before I begin my speech, just a quick reminders, I do take my POIs to voice, and my preferred pronouns are she, her. Starting in three, 2, 1, go. It doesn't mean I'm Filipina, that I'm all right with another Filipino making jokes about me having darker colored skin. So no matter how many times people paint this in a positive light, it never had to come from jokes, or it never had to come from something to be laughed at. I never thought this was funny, and I will never think that it's a funny thing or a funny joke. So I have one extraneous response before I move on to the clashes, right? Firstly, they tell us that there are incentives of comedians to not be racist, and that it's a white dominated industry anyway, so it's all right because the audience is fairly limited. So let's say that this is false for a number of reasons. First, there are Asian American comedians out there that are given platforms on that white dominated industry that they talk about. So not only are they given the platform, but they're also reaching out to an audience that doesn't only compose of that minority group, but composes of like the global audience. But two, these comedians are more likely to be racist because they need to phrase these slurs in a jokingly manner. But three, comedians have a lot of influence and are likely to be controlled by the media as well, meaning that they have lesser room to actually correct and keep these slurs. They need to keep these slurs really simple, meaning that they can't really explain, they cannot provide longer explanations to say, oh, it's just a joke, it's not something that's meant to be offensive. They're not going to say those things. They're simply going to make that joke about the slur, and that's basically it. Because comedy, right? Comedy is meant to be easy to understand, which is why they're not going to make it like a forum discussion. But even if you don't believe all of this, just note that you cannot predict how people will react or perceive all of these jokes. And the only time you'll find out if it's good or bad is at the moment where you've already potentially harmed these minority groups. And that's why we keep telling you throughout our speeches that it's harmful. So for the clashes, first clash, it's alleviating the severity of discrimination and etc. felt by these minority groups. This is the most important issue in the round, given that there are stakeholders directly affected and involved. So giving comedians authority to joke around these stereotypes only does significant harm to the very people that both sides ought to protect, right? We have two sub-issues under this. Firstly, on the urgency of solving the issues on discrimination, etc., which are propagated by stereotypes. So from first, we already tell you that it took centuries to break down stereotypes, and a lot of them still exist in the status quo. So this looks like individuals that literally poured out their blood, sweat, and tears, and they're trying to protect their communities and their loved ones because they cared about them. They know what they've been through. They know these experiences were literally hard on these people. And this is where our principle stands, independent of all the other points, because you'll never be able to break down stereotypes if you continue to treat them as jokes. Therefore, you delay that solvency that you're supposed to provide for these people. And again, Kristen has been telling you that not only does it stop getting solvency for these people, but literally on the individual level, you're hurting this person. This person is not likely to stand up and say, hey, stop saying that joke, I'm getting hurt. They're likely to just hurt inside and not share to the people because again, comedy has that high influence. A lot of the other people who are watching this comedian are just going to think it's a light, funny joke. But then secondly, under this, first proposition brings up one mitigation, right? Which is that people are actively going to call out these comedians when they're becoming racist. So first, we already told you that absent using all of these slurs and stereotypes in comedy within the minority groups, if you don't do that, it's way easier to call out people who are using them wrongly and who are using them in an offensive way. Because by the time you allow these jokes to exist, you have already spread a message such as like, oh, making these jokes are okay and anybody can make them because the comedian did. So if you don't have these jokes flying around, it's easier to call out people who are literally using these things as offensive messages towards others, right? But okay, I'll take your point.
Are you saying that if you just ignore these stereotypes that are set by white people and perpetuated by white people, they're just gonna break they're just gonna break by themselves?
No, that's not the point. The point here is that we're not going to use them in comedy. We're not going to ignore these stereotypes. Literally not. There are institutions, there are groups out there that literally advocate against these stereotypes. They're still going to exist and they exist outside of this debate. This debate is about using them in comedy. But the second sub-issue is on the effectiveness of the alleviation of the current people who undergo extreme discrimination and abuse, etc. Because we already talked to you about how people ought to recover from these stereotypes, right? It's not easy. It may take a long time. So what happens in opposition is that people affected will continuously hear about these jokes, and a lot of the audience worldwide are prone to misconstruing them. So sure, misconstruing of jokes happens on either side of the house, but the literal difference here is that we don't use these slurs. On government, we don't use slurs to make people laugh, which is why the harm is exclusive on opposition, and they haven't exactly dealt with this. So even if they don't misconstrue them, merely having these stereotypes as jokes or painting these things funny, like it's a comedian's job. They're not therapists. It's a comedian's goal to make people laugh and not provide people with a lesson on how not to be racist. So no matter how much comedians would want to correct their jokes, it has little to no effect on their audience. But secondly, under this, we tell you that we further empower alternatives that exist where these slurs and stereotypes can be discussed, such as the reclamation and serious discussions and identifications or correction and public disclosure discourse, sorry, about how we can dismantle it via protest, via these things that you could post on media instead of making these jokes about what people have been hurting on. So notice that we don't make jokes about slurs. There will be more attention towards the serious discussions instead of straying away from the issue by making jokes, which are likely to be popular anyway because it's on media, it sees comedians, so on and so forth. Okay, I'll take your other point.
How is it our burden to prove exactly how we're going to fix racism, but it's not your burden on your side of the house?
More likely it's your burden. It's not really anybody's burden to prove how we're going to fix racism, but what we're proving here is that it's much more harmful to have jokes about these slurs, because on your side you're literally tolerating these jokes existing, you're tolerating them being proliferated and spread out throughout the media. I don't understand how that's supposed to be less harmful. But the second issue, really quickly, is where are you able to better push for societal reform? It's important to stop these issues to proliferate on a global scale, right? This means then it matters what is displayed on these platforms, because as characterized, postings are public, comedians are influential. You don't like keep comedy videos private on TikTok. Literally anybody around the world can see them. First sub-issue, representation of minority groups. Opposition tells us that these jokes made by comedians create an accurate representation by the media. I beg to ask you, is it accurate that all Asians are probably bad at driving because of their eye shape? Is it accurate that all people with darker colored skin are prone to bombing places? So this point is completely a wash, because we already told you that representation is achieved when you direct people towards these serious discussions when it comes to typical racist slurs, so on. But on controlling the narrative, this is the main benefit of opposition, right? And my second speaker has already debunked this by telling you that these comedians do not have control simply because you don't tell people to feel, you don't tell people what to feel over these jokes. It doesn't mean somebody is hurt, like this certain minority group is hurt, that millions of other people will feel hurt too. The audience out there comprises of children, uninformed people, and not all of them are aware of these slurs. And for all those reasons, this is why we shouldn't allow slurs to be jokes.
Thanks to Go Whip for the fine speech. And now to conclude the constructive round, can we please have Op Whip whenever they're ready?
Okay, wait, let me get my time. Okay, so I prefer verbal POIs, and my speech will begin now. So today in my speech, I'll be going over two main clashes. Firstly, on which side will these minority groups be able to feel resonate with these comedians and feel more empowered? And secondly, on which side is there going to be better discourse for these minority groups and how society will actually react, right? So under the first clash, right? On which side are we better able to actually help these minority groups? So proposition tells us a few things. One of their main points is how these comedians will be actively contributing to these stereotypes and make the stereotypes the focus of comedies now, which therefore is somehow harmful, right? We tell you that yes, obviously it's going to be the focus of comedies now, but we think that proposition constantly throughout this entire debate has the wrong idea about what these comedians are actually going to do on their shows, and continuously strawmans our case throughout their speeches, right? Okay, so let me clarify this right now. We tell you that yes, these people are obviously going to be talking about these stereotypes, but in a way in which they're talking about their own experiences and what happened and why that's harmful, right? And talking about, for example, why these stereotypes shouldn't be existing in the first place. It's not like these people are just going to be dropping these stereotypes randomly and going oh, someone called me this racial slur and that's fine, haha, right?
POI.
I'll take you later. Comedy is sarcastic, it's satirical, and it's mockery, right? It's mocking the stereotypes, and it's not mocking the people who are affected by it. Just because something is a joke, it doesn't mean that it's going to be dismantling or dismissing people's struggles, right? And we think that it's so harmful for proposition to assume that we are allowing this sort of mockeries, right? We tell you that we don't see why these comedians would want to perpetuate these stereotypes when these stereotypes are directly harming them in the first place. And so it really doesn't make sense, right? We tell you that yes, it's going to be the focus of comedies, but now it's going to be shown in a good way, and it's going to be actually helping these minorities feel empowered or at least voice their struggles. They then tell us that just because they push stereotypes and use it, that's bad, as they really have no mechanism mechanism under this and fail to engage with us as to why like this is really true when we constantly explain to you what this like comedy will actually look like. As long as we prove to you in today's debate why these comedies are actually going to present it in a way in which they're able to actually dismantle these stereotypes, all our points still stand, right? We think that this also will exist when people are like there's always going to be people talking about stereotypes no matter what, right? There's always going to be discourse, and we're going to be better able to have this on our side, but because at least these comedians are able to actually talk about their own experience and really pull like these stereotypes down. So under this first clash on our side, we tell you that, for example, like comedy tends to be a lot more a more progressive area, and it's unlikely comedians will be like actively perpetuating the stereotypes. Moreover, we tell you that these minority groups will be able to actually resonate with these like comedians instead of feeling shamed, and they're actually able to have their struggles voiced and be able to actually, for example, seek help or fight back, right? Even in the worst case scenario, if everything they say is true, I don't think comedians will be like crushing someone's dream because someone said like I'm a housewife, right? All propositions point under this first clash are pretty unrealistic and unlikely to happen, and therefore we take the first clash. I'll take you if you want.
All right. What is it really? Are the jokes you say going to be said and framed as ridiculous, like you say in second? Or are these stereotypes and things going to be used to explain the issue and it's important? You can't have your cake and eat it too. You either give it some amount of importance through jokes or dismiss it
we tell
overall.
you that like
Be consistent.
we tell you that these jokes like okay, so firstly, obviously these comedians are going to be talking about their own like experiences, right? And they can be like, I don't see how any of the things you just said are exclusive, because they can be dismantling it and saying it's bad or ridiculing it at the same time, right? We only tell you that they won't be like just laughing at it and not doing anything after that. So, okay, so we tell you that like prop still doesn't really understand what it's going to look like. So moving on to the second clash, on which side is there going to be better discourse and like how society might actually like perceive it, right? So firstly, they tell us that the comedy is going to be shown to everyone and people can think that they can just use like the slurs, right? So we tell you that this entire argument is going like it's basically dependent on the incorrect characterization, and I've already explained to you why these jokes are likely going to be attacking these stereotypes and not just like agreeing with it and laughing on it. We tell you that on their side of the house, these racist people are still going to exist, and the people like who don't understand the stereotypes can't like emphasize like aren't going to be emphasizing with the other people as well, right? If people perceive it as okay, then that's on them because they're racist, right? It's not our burden to prove to you why like these racist people will change, right? No one's going to make a joke about a Chinese person if they saw a Chinese person like joking about it. We think that at least on our side, people who aren't inherently racist are going to be more educated or at least understand how harmful these stereotypes are because they saw someone talking about how they were affected and like talking about the different consequences they had, right? They tell us, so we tell you that like under this first point, prop basically pushed this entire burden of having to prove why we're like not able to make everyone racist, while this is not really something we need to prove. And we think that people who use like see racial slurs are okay exist on their world as well. So secondly, their second point is that like a comedian cannot control the narrative and how people perceive it. Yes, we agree, right? We never told you that they can like control what people are going to say after, but at least they're able to like paint this better narrative and use their own experiences to contribute something positive instead of allowing these stereotypes to go in the wrong direction, right? In the worst case, even if it's true that these comedians cannot like control whatever people think, at least they can in the worst case, when they can't control how people are receiving their jokes, at least they can control how people are like they can help the minorities and actually help them as well, right? We think that prop side under this point isn't effective as well because these minorities are still going to be affected by these slurs and stereotypes. And at least on our side, we have these minorities have something they can resonate with and empower them. And we think that in our worst case, that is enough, right? On our side, we tell you that we think that these comedies are a great platform to be able to dismantle these stereotypes because on other sort of mainstream platforms, there isn't really going to be that much discourse, right? And we think that on proposition side, comedy is going to look more like protest and all of their other ways of. The second point, we show you that their points don't really stand because we can't, they push this unrealistic burden onto us. And we also tell you why having these comedians actually be able to paint their own stories is enough, and why we have a larger impact, and I'm so proud to oppose.
Thanks to Opwip for the fine speech, and with that, we conclude the constructive round of this debate. Now to start with the reply round, can we have the Op reply whenever they're ready?
All right, start in. Okay, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. So everything that government side has tried to bring up in today's debate makes no sense to us. And also, they've been trying to push a burden onto us that they don't even attempt to prove why like they benefit anything on their side, right? So I'd like to finally rebut everything that they've brought up in today's debate. Firstly, the point that they've been trying to explain over and over again that just isn't properly mechanized or properly explained, which is that comedians are reinforcing stereotypes, and it makes people think that it's okay to use them, people that are outside of the minority group. But I think people know that it's offensive to call Asians like the Asian slur, the C word. There's a difference between like a white person saying the N word and a Black person saying it. Obviously, like, of course, we think people that are not part of the minority group shouldn't be making these types of jokes. However, when people see that only, for example, Black people use the N-word, they won't suddenly just think that, oh, as a white person, it's naturally okay for me to say the N-word, even though so many white people get canceled over saying it, right? So, and also on either side, we can't stop racist people from being racist, because either way, like, when they see the comedy, or when they see anything related to a minority group, they'll be racist, right? But at least we are bringing awareness to the issues that exist instead of ignoring them, right? This is where we win over on government side, right? Like we've said before, you don't stop the influence of these stereotypes. You just allow someone different to control that narrative and allow more accurate voices to be heard, and then the change can be made. So it's therefore far more likely to happen, at least on our side, right? If someone finds a joke offensive anyways, it's not like they're powerless. Like, they can point it out on social media. Like, someone can get canceled over it. They can just stop watching the comedy show. So the thing that they've said about, like, oh, crushing someone's dreams, it's very, very extreme. It's very unlikely that it's even going to happen. Which is a summarization of this entire point, and I've proven to you why it does not stand on any ground. And number 2, they say that, oh, this type of change doesn't have to come from jokes. However, they've given us no alternative and proven to us why that's better. But anyways, it's still better when there's at least more representation in all forms of media, including comedy, because it at least reaches as many people as possible. And we've proven to you countless times why this type of representation is positive, because these comedians will be facing the influence of these stereotypes in present day already. So obviously they would want to change it because it harms them directly, right? So we've said it countless times, but government side just clearly does not want to listen to it, and but obviously the mechanization is very clear. And number 3, they say that comedy is up to everyone else's interpretation. So like, sure, racist people can twist their jokes into something racist, but we think that the general public isn't stupid, and all, like, the general public is not stupid, right? And like, comedians want people to understand what their jokes are trying to express, so they're going to try their very best to make it, like, to frame it in a way that is like possible for people to understand, right? And like, the fact that they already have such a big fan base and they're already so famous makes it already means that they know how to craft jokes in a way that isn't offensive, and therefore they've become this successful, right? And okay, I'd like to summarize with a comparative, right? So government has brought up today no alternative, and what about the comedians? Like, what do they get to say in their comedies, right? Like, not everybody is the head of a social movement. Their comedy is one of the only ways they have influence. So how exactly are they supposed to try and attack these stereotypes, like, if they're not allowed to talk about issues that affect themselves? And in an industry already so predominantly white, they aren't voicing out the injustices. So like, yeah, they're staying silent because they shouldn't have a voice in society. Minorities can't be successful comedians because they're all boring and they can't, and therefore all comedians are white, right? This is what exists on proposition side, and we at least benefit these people in the minorities on our side, and I've never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks to Up reply. And now to conclude this debate, can we please have Prop reply?
All right, am I audible and visible?
Yes, you are.
All right, give me a second. I'll set up my camera. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opposition says that the general public is not misunderstanding as quite smart, but also in the same breath say the general public is going to be fine with white men making racist jokes. This is a great representation of the best of opposition because they are filled with inconsistency and convenience with their case. Let's talk about two main issues. Firstly, on empowerment, and second issue is going to be how on recommendation and social change is likely to be achieved on our side. Firstly, on empowerment, let's talk about the first clash of this issue is the individual solace, how we shouldn't use people as a jokes. We allow people to feel safe on our side and that their experience aren't going to be generalized. People called the entirety of Asia the source of Kung Flu virus and allowed it for further hate criming on the street. They aren't going to be open to the attacks of misunderstanding or any likelihood of that happening of the comedian's jokes, regardless of how good their intentions are on our side. Where minorities and opposition are only likely to be open to the mercy of the public, their capacity to understand, which their likelihoods were not proven and were only said so by an assertion. They say that this principle is not real, but does not prove at all why so. This is important because we are consistent with our narrative to give reparations to those who have struggled and are vulnerable to the attacks and harms that happen when more people feel that the stereotype is proliferated. This first sub issue is independent and round winning of what it talks about how other people are informed or changed because we win on urgency and protect the most vulnerable. Second clash under this issue then is where do we who can actually control the narrative? On opposition side, they tell us you control the narrative by simply following the white man's trend to use stereotypes in jokes and use it yourself as a minority means you're fighting against it. We told you it's likely to further affirm them, absent the mechanization from them on how it's actually going to be further weaponized or actually work on their side. We tell you we bring less comedic aspects on these serious and painful issues. That means less people are likely to laugh at a racist joke if it's not as proliferated. Less people are likely to feel like stereotypes have some sort of validity if less skits are made about them because we don't affirm it with even more work or even more comedy. We told you that this is not how it works, that we're just going to be able to control the narrative. Opposition can just control the narrative. These people make jokes and gain attentions. Their stance was completely convenient and unclear and contradictory. They say it's going to be comforting or say that these slurs are meaningless, but they don't tell us how educating people would be funny because no one wants to watch a social justice warrior or attention catching as much as controversy and as much as very sick jokes are more popular. They don't tell us why making a slur is meaningless in jokes when they're going to make a whole skit about it. This means they lose out on the very issue they spent all this time on. We're able to protect a lot more people who are struggled in entirety protection and not at the expense of how people perceive you or not at the expense of you being seen as a comedic joke, but inherently why we shouldn't make these jokes in the first place. Second main issue then, on reclamation and societal change. We told you that opposition had to make trade-offs. If you're going to drive all the attention on the serious slurs and stereotypes, we told you're only bringing traction on these on the realm of comedy at the expense of other platforms we talked to you about. It's all about finding a way to make a joke. It's all about willing to take a silly discussion. At best, their discussion is going to be shallow and only for comedic purposes. Therefore, their best cases ultimately are worse. We tell you we empower alternatives, that we don't simply bring them attention in the realms of comedy and make it more powerful in the sense of the movement, empowerment, and protest and when it comes to turnout. Because it's easier to feel like the issue is a lot more serious. It's easier to make it feel like it's actually worth turning out for and that these stereotypes are harming people, hurting people, allowing them to be hated on the streets and drive away from opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks to Gov reply, and with that we conclude this debate. Thanks to both the teams and all the judges for being here. The teams can virtually cross floor, virtually shake hand, and virtually have our discussion. I think what will happen now is